Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hey, today's video a little bit different. What we're going to be doing is going over some common whiskey myths that I think are worth chatting about. Because that's one of the things I love about whiskey cultures. There are tons of like folklore and myths and stories like that just kind of, I don't know, adds to the charm of it. You know what I mean? So some of these are actually kind of controversial topics within the whiskey community too. And the first one I want to start with is maybe one of the most controversial myths out there, period. And that is the myth about the neck pour. So what is that? Well, there's a myth that, whether you believe it or not, that the whiskey that ends up in the neck of the bottle is somehow worse than the rest of the juice in the bottle, okay? So there's a number of reasons why people believe that. Here, I'll use this bottle of Lafroig to illustrate. We see how this is mostly full, but there's empty space here in the neck of the bottle. Now, that's not just empty space. There's something in there. It's oxygen, right? So there's oxygen in the neck. And there is something that we do know to be true, and that's that oxygen over time can start to break down flavor components in whiskey. So, hence the myth that the whiskey that is at the top of the bottle, right up close to the neck, in direct contact with that oxygen, they call it the neck pour, and it's sort of generally believed that the first pour out of a bottle of whiskey is going to be worse than the rest of it. Now, that's fun superstition, maybe. Maybe you believe that to be true, but there are a number of scientific reasons why that is a full-blown myth, and that there is zero difference between the first pour and the pour that follows, or the pour that follows that. Let's start by talking about the oxygen. So, oxygen over time will start to break down flavor components in whiskey. That we know to be scientifically true. But there are a couple of things that are sort of prerequisites. One, that oxygen has to be in ratio greater than the volume of the booze itself. I mean, the greater the ratio of oxygen to booze, the quicker that transformation is going to happen, right? A neck pour does not have, the neck itself does not have a lot of oxygen in it. So it's not enough oxygen to actually change the flavor of the whiskey itself in that short amount of time that it's been on the shelf. It would take, so scientists have actually researched this at this point, that amount of oxygen, it would take it dozens of years. We're talking like 30 plus years before that oxygen is ever going to have any kind of a noticeable effect on the juice in the bottle. So that oxygen is not actually going to be breaking down enough flavor compounds to change the flavor of that whiskey unless you leave it on your shelf for 30, 40 years. Most of us are probably not doing that. But this whole idea that oxygen breaks down flavor components, that is true. And that's why, like we talked about ratios, if I were to drink this bottle down to about 25%. So this is now 75% air and 25% whiskey. That's when you want to redecant this into a smaller container. If you don't plan on finishing off that whiskey within the next month or two, then you're probably going to want to pour the rest of it out into a smaller glass bottle so that, again, you get your ratio back to this, where it's mostly booze in the bottle and a little bit of oxygen. But the neck itself, in comparison to the size of these bottles, that amount of oxygen, never going to affect it. Another reason why this is myth is it also assumes that what you pour out of the bottle is only going to be the liquid that was at the top. But when you tip the bottle to pour it out, you're not taking a ladle and just scooping the top liquid off. You're tipping the bottle on its side. Now, when you do that, you are pouring out juice that was down here, because you're tipping it on its side. It's not just the juice that's right here at the top. That's not what's coming out of the bottle. You know what I mean? So when you get that neck pour, it's not like you're only getting just that top liter, you're not scooping it off the surface. And the third major reason why this is myth is because, and this is what scientists commonly agree on, and even distillers agree on this too, they're like, listen, you have to understand, when you go in for your first sip of whiskey, you have to acclimate yourself to drinking whiskey, acclimate your palate to it. That's why when people are doing tastings and reviews, they always talk about what they get on the second sip. I go back in for a second sip and I get this and I get this. You hear that commonly stated by reviewers and tasters because you have to acclimate your palate. So if you're getting a neck pour, that is probably, that means that this is your first sip of that whiskey. So you have to acclimate your palate to it before you can really start to open up those flavors anyway. Whether it's a neck pour or you're starting down here, if it's your first pour, it's probably going to open up over time as you acclimate your palate anyways. So what people are falsely attributing to being a neck pour quality is actually themselves having their first sip and having to acclimate their palate to the whiskey to begin with. So all that to say, there is zero scientific evidence to date, and it has been studied, but there's zero scientific evidence to date that will affirm that a neck pour is worse in quality than the rest of the juice. So you can believe that if you want to. I enjoy superstition anyways. I think it's fun. But just so you know, that has never scientifically been proven. Neck pour, myth number 1. All right, this one is also hotly debated. But myth number 2 is that most of the flavor that you get out of a finishing barrel is flavor that is imparted by the liquid that once occupied that barrel. So, for example, if you take a scotch and then you finish it in a port, sherry, Madeira cask that had wine in it, the assumption is that most of the flavor you're going to get out of that finishing cask is going to be from the wine, the port, the sherry, the Madeira. Now, it is true that you are going to grab some of those flavors from that previous liquid, the previous occupant of that space. But actually, most of the flavor you're going to get out of a finishing barrel is going to come from the wood, from the barrel itself. So the wood itself, the oak, is the primary contributor of flavor compounds in a whiskey. Most of the flavor is going to come from that barrel, because as wood seasons, as it ages, as it dries, as it kilns, all of those processes are creating new flavors in the wood itself, new sugars, new tannins. It's breaking down other flavor components that are not desirable. It's creating a rich environment full of flavor, like your vanillins, that your whiskey is going to go into the barrel, grab it, and then come back out with those flavors, bring them back with them. So, for example, if you were then to take your bourbon and then finish it in a barrel that once contained cognac, it's probably going to, not probably, it is going to actually grab more flavor out of the French oak that cognac is traditionally aged in. It's going to get more French oak flavor out of that barrel than it's going to get cognac. It will get some cognac, absolutely, or else people wouldn't do it. You wouldn't be finishing in these barrels if you didn't get any good flavor from the previous occupant of that barrel. You certainly do, but most of the flavor that's going to be contributed to your whiskey is actually going to come from the wood itself of that second barrel. So the next time you go to taste a whiskey that has been finished in a separate barrel, you have to ask yourself what's unique about the barrel too, because you may be falsely attributing flavors that you're getting to whatever was in the barrel when you should be attributing those flavors to the wood itself. Now, like I said, that one is actually still hotly debated in the whiskey community, but again, science is showing that more flavor compounds themselves are being contributed by the wood. Now, the next 2 myths I want to hit are actually historical myths. The first of those 2 myths is that bourbon whiskey was invented by rye distillers who hopped onto a raft and sailed down the river out of the Pennsylvania area because they were fleeing during the Whiskey Rebellion. So the rye distillers there in Pennsylvania, obviously, the Whiskey Rebellion happened. They were revolting against the new taxation rules and policies that were implemented by none other than Alexander Hamilton himself and the federal government. And some of these people, when the fuzz came for them, the federal marshals were coming for them, they hopped on these rafts and these boats and they took off south to try to evade them. And the myth is that they ended up in Kentucky, where they started distilling with, what was growing there, which was corn, maize. So these rye whiskey distillers from Pennsylvania are commonly attributed, they're often given credit for the invention of bourbon whiskey. There are several problems with this, though. First and foremost, corn whiskey was already being distilled in Kentucky before these people ever showed up. Some of the first colonists that ever got to Kentucky were bringing their stills with them because that's what you did as a farmer, because it basically gives you more mileage out of your crop. So, especially back then, we didn't have trucks and trains to help move the product. So a farmer would have to move the product on their own, and that was a challenge. I mean, that's a lot of weight. It's bulky. It's cumbersome to try and move, actual ears of corn. So you would sell what you could and use it as currency where you could, but then often you would have a lot left over from your crops that you would just have to call a loss. You'd have to pitch it, throw it away. But instead, farmers were finding that they could use it as distillation fuel to create corn whiskey, and then they could use their corn whiskey, which is a lot easier to transport, put it in a barrel, transport it, sell it, use it as currency. That was a lot easier. So before these rye distillers ever ended up in Kentucky, corn whiskey distillation was already taking place by the current occupants. So that's problem number one. So they couldn't have been inventing it if it was already happening. Problem number two, Kentucky was patrolled by federal marshals. If you're running away from the cops, you don't stop next to a police station. You just don't do it. So most of the people who were running away from the fuzz, from the Whiskey Rebellion, they didn't stop in Kentucky. They kept going. They kept going all the way down to New Orleans at the time, which was not, U.S. space. So they would escape the fuzz there, and that's where they would seek refuge. So I've actually seen a number of, whiskey writers and books. They overlook this, and they unfortunately, they don't give credit where it's due. And they're like, oh yeah, the rye distillers from Pennsylvania ended up in Kentucky, started distilling corn whiskey, and then bourbon was born. And that is a gross oversimplification, and doesn't give credit where it's due. And along those lines, the fourth and final whiskey myth that I want to hit tonight is this myth that Elijah Craig is the father of bourbon. So again, we have a situation where someone is being credited with the discovery and the, conception, the genesis of bourbon whiskey. And so this is interesting. Elijah Craig is not historically given credit for being the father of bourbon. In fact, that myth comes from a single writer in a magazine or newspaper publication at the time, long after the guy was dead, and some dude just made a blanket statement and gave him credit without, actual evidence, without any supporting documents. So he kind of just carelessly and recklessly gives credit to Elijah Craig, who was a known distiller in Kentucky, who was distilling corn whiskey. And this was years later, because the word bourbon wouldn't actually catch on. It wouldn't actually be a label, a proper name for this kind of whiskey, until long after Elijah Craig was dead. So obviously the Elijah Craig brand is going to latch onto that statement and be like, yep, that's 100% true, and they're going to put it on all their bottles. And I love Elijah Craig products, do not get me wrong. But this is actually a myth. Elijah Craig is far from being the father of bourbon. In fact, he did neither of these two things first. Neither was he the first to distill corn whiskey, nor was he the first to call it bourbon. In fact, it wouldn't be called bourbon until long after he was dead and gone. But there's some really interesting documentation that helps to solidify that this is a bona fide myth. First and foremost, we have actual physical records and documents and manifests of people who came to Kentucky and settled there before Elijah Craig ever came. So we actually have manifests of his voyage over, and timestamps on these documents show that people came before him and were distilling corn whiskey and actually selling, making transactions. We have receipts of corn whiskey being traded in Kentucky before Elijah Craig ever got there. So he was A, not the first distiller in Kentucky. B, he was not the first to distill corn whiskey. That was already being done before he got there. When he got there, people were doing it, and he was a minister, Baptist minister at the time, and he started doing it as well. He was just following suit. And then there's some pushback where people say, well, maybe he wasn't the first to distill corn whiskey, but he was definitely the first to age corn whiskey in charred oak barrels, which is what makes bourbon bourbon. This is also verifiably false. We already, again, have transaction statements of people who were purchasing charred oak barrels that were used to make things like cognac and things of the sort, because that was already a common practice. Fortified wines and wine makers were already using charred oak barrels to age their wines in. It was already common practice. And so the people who were distilling corn whiskey would often purchase these barrels and use that charred wood already, just because it was a barrel that was watertight, already made for containing, a liquid of some kind, and they were buying them and using them before Elijah Craig ever got to Kentucky. So he did not distill corn whiskey first. He did not age it in charred oak barrels first. We have documentation that shows that's not true. And then another really interesting bit of information we have as well is a record, which is a sort of transcript of the eulogy at his funeral. So, in fact, one of his close friends, who was also a distiller at the time, presented his eulogy and spoke at his funeral. And in his toast to his dead friend, this guy did not even once mention Elijah Craig's distillation. Talked about his legacy as a preacher, as a father, and a family man, but never called him an entrepreneur, never accredited any kind of distillation feats to him, let alone being the father of bourbon whiskey. And you would think, if you were a distiller and you wanted to honor your dead friend, that you would think that if your dead friend had done something monumental in that field, you would say something, right? You would take that opportunity to say, my man Elijah, dude, the stuff he did in the distillation community, the way that he fathered and entrepreneurialized bourbon, you would say something like that. But this guy mentioned none of that, which is sort of like guilty by omission. We're assuming that he probably didn't do anything that warranted noteworthiness in the whiskey community beyond just being a distiller alongside other distillers. So this isn't to crap on Elijah Craig's legacy at all, not at all, but we do need to give credit where it's due. And the invention of bourbon whiskey came as a long, slow process over time, and there were many contributing people. It was no single person who was given credit for the invention of bourbon. It happened courtesy of a long line of people. It was a collective effort by the whole distillation community in the Kentucky region, and then even down into New Orleans as well. So there you have it. Those are 4 big whiskey myths that I think are really interesting and fun talking about. So let me know which one was most interesting to you. Let me know if you learned anything new, and if you did, leave a like in the video to let me know. Hey, if you enjoy your time here on the channel, please feel free to subscribe and get access to new whiskey content as I post it. Big shout out to my Patreon supporters who help fund the channel. Really appreciate you guys and all the bottles I'm able to pick up. Thanks to your generous support. Really looking forward to diving into some of these whiskeys with you guys for our Patreon supporter virtual tasting. I had a lot of fun packaging up all the samples for you guys and shipping them out to you. And I know almost all of you have received those now. That's really cool. Can't wait to dive into those together in our virtual tasting in Discord. If you want to get in on that Discord or in the Patreon, check the links in the description and you can do so. The Discord is totally free to join, and you'll have access to our conversations there. I hope to see you there. Hey, cheers. May you live richly and get better with age. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.